When he left the orphanage, they told him he had inherited a limestone cavern, a worthless hole in the ground on a forgotten piece of land. What he found inside would not only change his life, it would save it. If you've ever felt like your story was written for you by someone else, hit that subscribe button, because we're going to talk about how to find the pen and write your own ending. The day I turned 18 was the day I ceased to exist, at least in the eyes of the state of Illinois. For 10 years, I had been Leo Carter, ward number 734, a file in a cabinet, a line item in a budget. Now, I was just Leo, a name without an anchor. Mrs. Gable, the director at St. Jude's Home for Boys, handed me a cardboard box with the same dispassionate efficiency she used to hand out demerits. Inside were the collected artifacts of a life lived in institutional beige. 3 changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book I'd read 100 times, a toothbrush, and a thin manila envelope. "Everything's in there," she said, her voice raspy from 1,000 morning announcements. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were already on the next boy in line, the next file to be managed. "Bus pass to the city, your final stipend, and a letter from the probate court. Good luck, Leo. Good luck." The words felt like pebbles tossed into a well, a meaningless gesture before the silence closed in. I stood on the cracked concrete steps of the only home I could remember, the gray March sky pressing down like a damp cloth. The air smelled of wet pavement and the industrial soap they used on the floors. For a decade, my world had been defined by bells. Bells for waking, bells for meals, bells for lockdown. Now, there was only the sound of the wind rattling the bare branches of the oak tree in the yard and the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. The silence was terrifying. It was a void where a structure used to be. I looked back at the red brick building, at the rows of identical windows staring out like vacant eyes. I thought I should feel something. Freedom, maybe, or sadness, anger. But there was nothing, just a dull, hollow ache, the phantom limb of a childhood I never really had. The other boys, the ones who weren't aging out, watched me from the rec room window. Their faces were pale blurs, temporary ghosts in a place designed to be forgotten. I didn't wave. They wouldn't have waved back. In a place like St. Jude's, you learn that attachments are liabilities. Goodbyes are just closed doors. I shifted the weight of the box in my arms. It wasn't heavy, but it felt monumental, the sum total of my worldly possessions. I walked down the long driveway, each step taking me further from the known and deeper into a vast, terrifying unknown. The stipend, I knew, was $500, enough to last a week, maybe 2 if I was careful. After that, the world had a way of swallowing boys like me. We were statistics in waiting. I didn't open the manila envelope until I was on the bus, the city skyline a hazy promise on the horizon. The bus groaned and hissed, filled with people going somewhere definite, somewhere they belonged. I felt like a particle of dust, caught in the current but belonging to nothing. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter, dense with legal jargon, and a single, old-fashioned brass key. I skimmed the impenetrable text, my eyes catching on phrases, last will and testament, sole surviving heir, Elias Carter. Elias Carter, my grandfather. A man whose name I knew only from a faded notation in my file. He'd signed the papers that put me in St. Jude's after my parents died, and then he had vanished from my life as completely as they had. The letter stated that he had passed away 6 months ago and had left me his entire estate. My heart gave a stupid, hopeful little flutter. An estate. The word conjured images of mansions, of money, of a life I'd only seen in movies. A fresh start, a real one. Then I read the next line. The estate consisted of a single parcel of land, 15 acres in a town I'd never heard of, called Sparrow Creek, a place described in the attached documents as unimproved rural property. The centerpiece of this property, its primary feature according to a geological survey from the 1970s, was a limestone cavern, a cave. My inheritance was a hole in the ground. The hope in my chest collapsed into a familiar, bitter dust. Of course, it was a perfect metaphor for my life, a hollow space decorated with the illusion of substance. The letter instructed me to present myself at the law offices of Finch and Associates on LaSalle Street to finalize the transfer of the deed. The key, I guessed, was for a door that probably no longer existed on a property that was worth less than the paper it was described on. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the bus window and watched the world slide by, feeling the full, crushing weight of being 18 and completely, utterly alone. The silence I'd felt leaving the home wasn't freedom. It was the sound of the world having no expectations of me at all. The law office of Alastair Finch was on the 7th floor of a building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. It was a world away from St. Jude's, a place of quiet, carpeted corridors and hushed, important voices. I felt my worn jeans and thin jacket were a language everyone here could read, and it said, "He doesn't belong." I gave my name to a receptionist who looked at me over the top of her glasses with an expression of polite disinterest, and I sat in a leather chair that sighed when I sank into it. The chair was probably worth more than my entire cardboard box of possessions. After a wait that felt long enough for me to grow roots, a door opened and a man with a tired face and kind eyes beckoned me in. "Mr. Carter, I'm Alastair Finch. Please, come in." His office was lined with books, not for show, but the kind that looked like they'd been read and referenced for decades. The spines were cracked, the pages softened with use. A large window looked out over the steel and glass canyons of the city. Mr. Finch gestured to a chair opposite his massive oak desk, which was an organized chaos of files and legal pads. He didn't seem to notice my clothes or the box I placed carefully by my feet. He just looked at me, his gaze steady and serious. "Thank you for coming in, Leo," he began, folding his hands on the desk. "I was your grandfather's attorney for the last 20 years of his life. I'm sorry for your loss." The words were standard, but his tone was sincere. I just nodded, unsure what to say. How do you mourn a man you can't remember? "I didn't know him," I said, and the words sounded small and inadequate in the quiet room. "I know," Mr. Finch said softly. "He spoke of you often. He had his reasons for the distance, reasons I'm not entirely at liberty to discuss, but he wanted you to have the land. It was all he had left." He slid a thick stack of papers across the desk toward me. "This is the deed. It's legally yours, free and clear. All taxes are paid up to date." I stared at the documents, the official seals, the dense print. It felt unreal. The letter mentioned a cave. Mr. Finch leaned back, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. "Ah, yes, the cavern. Your grandfather was fascinated by it, spent most of his time there. From a legal and financial standpoint, it's a liability. Makes the land nearly impossible to develop. The soil is thin, rocky. It's not good for farming. Not good for building." He paused, letting the reality of it sink in. "It's not worth much, I'm afraid." There it was, the punchline to the joke I didn't know was being told. I felt my shoulders slump. "So what am I supposed to do with it?" "Well," he said, pulling another thinner file from a drawer, "there is one standing offer. A development group, Northwood Holdings, has been trying to acquire the land for years. They want to quarry the limestone. They're offering $20,000. He pushed a single sheet of paper with their letterhead on it toward me. $20,000. The number hung in the air, shimmering. To me, it wasn't just a sum of money. It was a universe of possibility. It was a security deposit on an apartment. It was food for a year. It was a bus ticket to somewhere warm, somewhere new. It was a shield against the statistical certainty of my future. It was a way out. All I had to do was sign a piece of paper and trade a hole in the ground I'd never seen for a chance at a life. It was the only sensible thing to do. "They've been trying to buy it for years?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't my grandfather sell?" Mr. Finch looked out the window for a long moment, watching the tiny cars move far below. "He believed the land was worth more than money," he said, finally turning his gaze back to me. "He told me once that its value wasn't something you could spend, but something you could live inside. He was a bit of a poet, your grandfather, and a very stubborn man." He tapped a pen on the desk. "The offer is open-ended. Northwood is patient. You don't have to decide today. My advice, for what it's worth? Go see it. See what you're selling before you sign it away." I looked from the developer's offer to the thick, intimidating deed. One was a simple, clean transaction. The other was a mystery tied to a man I didn't know and a past I couldn't remember. Every instinct I had honed at St. Jude's, the instinct for survival, for pragmatism, for taking the sure thing, screamed at me to sign the paper, take the money, and run. But then I thought of the key in my pocket, its edges worn smooth. A key to nothing, maybe, or a key to everything. For the first time, I had a choice that was entirely my own. The choice between a future that was bought and paid for, and one that was waiting to be discovered. I left Mr. Finch's office with the deed in my envelope and his advice echoing in my head. I spent one night in a cheap hostel in the city, the sounds of sirens and strangers keeping me awake. The $20,000 offer felt like a hot coal in my pocket. It was the smart move, the logical move. But the thought of my grandfather, a stubborn poet who believed a worthless piece of land held some intangible value, wouldn't leave me alone. What did he see that a development company didn't? What was he protecting? The next morning, with most of my $500 stipend still intact, I bought a bus ticket to Sparrow Creek. It felt like the stupidest decision I had ever made. It also felt like the only one. The bus ride was a journey backward in time. The skyscrapers and highways of the city bled into sprawling suburbs, then into patchwork farmland, and finally into dense, rolling hills of forest and rock. The farther we went, the fewer people were on the bus. By the last hour, it was just me, an old woman knitting, and the driver. The world outside the window grew quieter, wilder. This was the landscape of my inheritance. Sparrow Creek wasn't so much a town as a footnote on a map. The bus stopped in front of a single building that served as the post office, general store, and unofficial town hall. A sign with peeling paint read, "Sparrow Creek, population 212. I stepped off the bus into air that was crisp and smelled of pine and damp earth. It was so quiet I could hear the rustle of leaves in the trees and the distant caw of a crow. The silence here was different from the silence of St. Jude's. It wasn't an absence of noise, it was a presence of peace. It felt ancient and unsettling. I went into the general store to ask for directions. The man behind the counter was old, his face a road map of wrinkles. He looked me up and down, his gaze lingering on my city clothes and the box I carried. "You're not from around here," he stated. It wasn't a question. "No, sir," I said. "I'm looking for the old Carter place." His expression soured slightly. "Elias's place? What for?" "He was my grandfather. He left it to me." The man's demeanor shifted. The suspicion in his eyes softened into something like pity. "Elias's grandson, huh?
Didn't know he had one."
He wiped the counter with a damp rag. "Well, it ain't much to look at. Head north out of town on the old quarry road, about 3 miles. You'll see a rusted gate on your left. That's it. Can't miss it." He paused. "You planning on staying out there?" "Just for a look," I said. He grunted. "Good luck. Place has been falling apart for years, ever since Elias got too sick to keep it up." He turned away, busying himself with stocking shelves, the conversation clearly over. The walk was long. The gravel road crunched under my worn sneakers, and the box grew heavier with every step. There were no other cars, no other people. Just the trees, the sky, and the feeling of being watched by 1,000 unseen things in the woods. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A rusted, sagging wire gate hanging from a single hinge, choked with weeds. A faded wooden sign nailed to a post was barely legible. Carter. This was it. My inheritance. My kingdom of dirt and rock. I pushed the gate open. It screamed in protest. I stepped through, onto a path so overgrown it was little more than a suggestion, and walked toward whatever waited for me in the trees. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer under the thick canopy of leaves. I felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. I was walking into the heart of the mystery, and I had no idea if I would find a home or just another empty room. The path twisted through dense woods for another 1/4 mile before opening into a small, lumpy clearing. And there, in the middle of it, was the cabin. It was smaller than I'd imagined, more of a shack, really. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired old horse. The porch steps had rotted through in places, and the windows were clouded with years of grime. A stone chimney, covered in moss, listed to one side. It looked like one good gust of wind would knock the whole thing over. It was the saddest, most desolate-looking place I had ever seen. And it was mine. I walked a slow circle around it. The silence was absolute. No bells, no traffic, just the whisper of the wind through the pines. I tried the key Mr. Finch had given me on the cabin's front door, but the lock was rusted solid. It wouldn't budge. My heart sank. So much for that. I peered through a dirty window. The inside was a mess of shadows, but I could make out the shape of a simple wooden table, a chair, a cold fireplace. It was a ghost of a home. Feeling defeated, I sat on the one solid-looking porch step and put my head in my hands. What was I doing here? I should have taken the money. This was a fool's errand, chasing the ghost of a man who'd abandoned me to a place of ruin. The $20,000 offer felt like a lifeline I had stupidly refused to grab. I could still go back. I could call Mr. Finch, tell him to sell. I could be on a bus to anywhere by tomorrow. But something kept me there. the quiet, maybe, or the stubborn part of me that had inherited more from my grandfather than just his land. I stood up and decided to explore the rest of the property. Behind the cabin, the ground sloped upward into a steep, rocky hillside. The trees thinned out, giving way to moss-covered limestone outcroppings. And then I saw it. Tucked into the base of the hill, partially hidden by a curtain of overgrown ivy, was a dark opening. A mouth in the earth. The cavern. It was bigger than I expected, a dark, vertical slash in the rock, easily tall enough for a person to walk into. A palpable coldness emanated from the entrance, carrying with it the smell of wet stone and deep earth. It smelled ancient. I hesitated at the threshold, a primal fear of the dark, of enclosed spaces rising in my throat. This was the liability, the worthless feature that made my land unsellable. It was just a dark, empty hole. I was about to turn away when my eye caught a glint of metal, to be waterproof and indestructible. It was an old military surplus ammunition can, the kind designed to be waterproof and indestructible. It was closed with a heavy latch. Scratched crudely into the painted metal surface was a single word: Leo. My breath caught in my chest. It was for me. He had left it for me. I ran my fingers over the rough letters of my own name. Suddenly, the cavern didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a waiting room. I grabbed the handle. The box was heavy, solid. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers clumsy with a sudden, frantic energy. It was stuck fast with rust. I found a loose rock on the ground and hammered at the latch, the sharp clang echoing in the silence of the clearing. Again and again I struck it, fueled by a desperate, rising hope. Finally, with a loud crack, the rust gave way and the latch sprang open. I lifted the lid. The air inside smelled of oilcloth and old paper. My inheritance wasn't the land or the cabin or the cave. It was this. It was whatever was inside this box. My hands were shaking as I reached into the box. The first thing I pulled out was a heavy-duty headlamp, the kind miners or cavers use. It was old but looked well-maintained. Next was a small brass compass, its glass face clean and unscratched. Beneath that, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a single, tarnished brass key, much smaller and more intricate than the one for the cabin. And at the very bottom, sealed in a thick, waterproof pouch, was a stack of letters tied together with a piece of twine. I took the letters out and sat on the ground, my back against the cold rock face of the cave entrance. The name on the top envelope wasn't written to Leo Carter, Ward number 734. It just said, "For my grandson." I untied the twine. The paper was thick and yellowed, and the handwriting was a dense, slanted script written in fountain pen ink that had faded from black to a soft gray. I began to read. "Leo," it started, "if you are reading this, then it means I am gone, and the world has finally sent you home. I imagine you have many questions, and I imagine you hate me. You have every right. I want you to know the truth, not the version in the state's file, but my truth. I hope by the end of it, you might understand." My eyes blurred with tears I didn't know I had. I wiped them away angrily and kept reading. "Giving you to the state was the hardest thing I have ever done. It was not abandonment, my boy. It was a desperate act of protection. Your parents, my son and his wife, were good people, but they got tangled up with some very bad men over a business deal gone wrong. When they died, that trouble didn't die with them. It transferred to me, and by extension, to you. They would have come for you. To keep you safe, I had to make you disappear. I had to erase myself from your life so they couldn't use me to find you. I became a ghost so you could have a chance to grow up. I had to stop reading. My whole body was trembling. The story I had told myself for 10 years, the story of a grandfather who didn't want me, who had thrown me away, crumbled into dust. It wasn't a story of abandonment. It was a story of sacrifice. I thought of him, alone in that dilapidated cabin for all those years, holding this secret, watching me from a distance I couldn't even imagine. The hollow ache in my chest filled with a confusing storm of emotions. Grief for the years we'd lost, a fierce, sudden love for this stranger, and a hot, searing anger at the faceless men who had stolen my family from me. I forced myself to read on. This land, he wrote, is not our land. Our family has never owned it in the legal sense for long, but we have been its keepers for generations. The deed is just a piece of paper. The real inheritance is the cavern. The world above ground is filled with noise and greed. Developers like Northwood see only rock to be crushed into gravel. They see profit. They don't see the truth of this place. Its value is not in what can be taken from it, but what it holds inside. I have spent my life learning its secrets. Now, they are your secrets. Don't sell it, Leo. Not yet. There is more for you here than money. Your future is not on the surface. It is in the deep. When you are ready, use the headlamp. Go inside. Follow the water's memory to the place where the stone weeps. Your real inheritance is waiting there. He signed it simply, your grandfather, Elias. I read the letter 3 times, the words sinking into me like rain into dry earth. Follow the water's memory, where the stone weeps. It was a riddle, a treasure map. He had left me a quest. I looked from the letter to the dark, waiting maw of the cave. He was asking me to step out of the world I knew, the world of logic and bus tickets and $500 stipends, and step into his world of secrets and poetry. He was asking me to have faith. I stood up, my legs unsteady. The key he'd left in the box was for the cabin. I knew it instinctively. I walked back to the shack, my mind reeling. The world had tilted on its axis. Everything I thought I knew about my own life was wrong. I was not the unwanted refuse of a broken family. I was the protected heir to a secret legacy. I slid the small, tarnished key into the rusted lock of the cabin door. It resisted. Then, with a stubborn groan of metal, it turned. The door swung inward with a low creak, releasing a sigh of stale, trapped air. I stepped inside. The interior was Spartan. A simple wooden bed with a threadbare blanket, a small table with 1 chair, a stone fireplace filled with old ash, and a shelf of books. It was the room of a man who owned very little. But it was clean, tidy. Even through the years of neglect, I could see the care he had taken. This wasn't a place of despair. It was a place of quiet purpose. I ran my hand over the dusty table. He had lived here. He had slept in that bed, read those books, and thought of me. The weight of it all crashed down on me. I sank into the chair and finally let myself cry. I cried for the 10 years I had spent in a place without love, convinced I was worthless. I cried for the grandfather I never got to meet, this brave, poetic, stubborn man who had lived like a hermit to keep me safe. I cried for the parents I barely remembered, and I cried from the sheer, overwhelming terror of the choice that lay before me. The sensible world was calling. Mr. Finch's voice of reason echoed in my head. The $20,000 offer from Northwood Holdings was still on the table. It was real. It was tangible. I could take that money and walk away from all of this. I could get an apartment, a job, an education. I could build a normal life, free from the ghosts of Sparrow Creek and the shadows of this cave. No one would blame me. It was the logical thing to do. Selling this place was selling a burden. It was selling a falling down shack and a hole in the ground full of bad memories. But was that the truth? My grandfather's letter sat on the table, its presence feeling heavier than a stack of gold bars. He hadn't left me a burden. He had left me a test. A choice between the easy money of the world and the difficult, hidden value of his legacy. He was asking me to believe in him, to believe that what he had protected for me was worth more than a developer's check. I sat there for hours as the light outside faded, the cabin slowly sinking into a deep, rural darkness. The choice was a physical weight inside me. One path led to a life that made sense. The other led into the dark. And if you've made it this far, maybe you know what it's like to stand at a crossroads like that. A choice between what the world tells you is valuable and what your heart whispers is true. If this is hitting you, let me know in the comments. We're a community of people who have walked difficult paths, and your story matters here. You're not alone in that struggle. As the last of the twilight vanished and the cabin became a pitch-black box, I made my decision. I was done with the sensible world. The sensible world had given me a number instead of a name, and a cardboard box for a future. For the first time in my life, I was going to choose faith over fear. I was going to choose the mystery. I took the headlamp from the ammo can, its heavy plastic cool against my skin. I strapped it to my forehead. I took the compass, and I walked out of the cabin, leaving the door open behind me, and headed for the entrance of the cave. The night was moonless, and the darkness was absolute, but I wasn't afraid. I had a light. The beam from the headlamp cut a sharp white cone into the oppressive darkness of the cavern entrance. It illuminated a world of damp, gray stone, glistening with moisture. The air was instantly colder, the silence more profound. Every drip of water from the ceiling echoed like a drumbeat in a vast, empty hall. My own breathing sounded impossibly loud. I took a step inside, and then another, leaving the world of trees and sky behind me. The main passage was wide and tall, the floor a rough but relatively flat surface of packed earth and stone. The walls were a tapestry of textures, smooth, water-worn sections giving way to rough, crystalline formations that sparkled in my light. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. I felt like an intruder in a place that had been sleeping for 1,000,000 years. I thought of my grandfather's words, "Follow the water's memory to the place where the stone weeps." At first, I didn't understand. The cavern seemed dry, apart from the occasional drip. But as I walked deeper, my light fell upon a thin, dark line carved into the stone floor. A shallow channel no wider than my hand. It was a waterway, long, dry, that snaked its way deeper into the earth. The water's memory. This had to be it. My heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement. I followed the channel. It led me away from the main cathedral-like passage and into a series of smaller, tighter tunnels. The ceiling lowered, forcing me to duck my head. The air grew heavier, thick with the mineral scent of the deep earth. I could hear a constant, faint trickling sound now, growing steadily louder as I pressed on. After maybe 20 minutes of walking, the narrow tunnel opened into a small grotto. And there, I saw it. One entire wall of the chamber was covered in a shimmering, flowing curtain of calcite, a mineral deposit left by millennia of dripping water. It looked exactly like a frozen waterfall. The stone weeps. I had found it. But I saw it. The place where the stone weeps. I had found it. But I saw no inheritance. There was no treasure chest, no hidden door. Just a beautiful, damp wall of rock. I felt a pang of disappointment. Had I misunderstood? Was this just a poetic landmark, a beautiful dead end? I ran my hand over the weeping wall. The stone was slick and cold, almost like glass. I leaned in closer, sweeping my light across its surface, searching for any sign, any clue. Then I noticed something. Near the bottom, behind the main curtain of flowing stone, the darkness seemed different. It wasn't the solid black of rock, but a deeper, more absolute black. A void. I pushed aside a thick, hanging tendril of ivy that had managed to grow even here in the near-total darkness, and saw it. A narrow gap. An opening no wider than my shoulders. It wasn't a door. It was a crack. A hidden passage concealed by the calcite waterfall. My claustrophobia screamed at me. To go through that gap would mean squeezing myself into the guts of the earth. Every rational instinct told me to turn back. But my grandfather's voice, from the letter, was stronger. He had done this. He had walked this path. I took a deep breath, turned sideways, and began to push myself into the opening. The rock was cold and unforgiving, scraping at my jacket. For a terrifying moment, I thought I was stuck. I exhaled, made myself smaller, and pushed harder. Then, with a sudden release of pressure, I was through. I stumbled forward, out of the tight passage, and into open space. I spun around, sweeping the beam of my headlamp across my new surroundings, and my jaw dropped. I wasn't in a cave anymore. I was in a workshop. The passage had opened into a massive, hidden chamber, at least 50 feet high and twice as wide. Its ceiling a breathtaking dome of glittering crystals. And built into the center of this natural cathedral was a workspace that defied belief. There were 2 long, sturdy workbenches made of heavy timber. On one, an array of delicate carving tools, chisels and picks, were laid out with surgical precision. On the other sat grinding and polishing machines, their metal surfaces covered in a fine layer of white stone dust. Shelves carved directly into the cavern walls were filled with geological wonders. Giant geodes, split open to reveal amethyst hearts. Chunks of raw quartz, clear as ice. Veins of malachite, their green swirls like abstract paintings. And everywhere there were pieces of the weeping stone, the fluorescent calcite, in various stages of being worked. Some were rough, raw chunks. Others had been polished into smooth, glowing orbs. Against the far wall, geological maps were pinned up, covered in my grandfather's slanted script, marking veins and discoveries within the cave system. This wasn't just a hobby. This was a life's work, a secret subterranean laboratory and art studio. My grandfather hadn't just been a stubborn old man hiding in a cabin. He had been a scientist, an artist, a creator. On the main workbench, next to a half-finished sculpture of a bird in flight, carved from a single piece of glowing calcite, was another ammo can, larger than the first. This one wasn't locked. I opened it. Inside, there were no riddles. It was filled to the brim with more letters, photographs, and a thick, leather-bound journal. I picked up the journal. On the first page, in my grandfather's familiar hand, it said, "Everything I know, for Leo." This was it, the real inheritance. It wasn't a chest of gold or a pile of cash. It was better. It was a legacy. It was a purpose. It was the story of my family, hidden away in the heart of the earth, waiting for me to find it. I sank onto a dusty stool, the single beam of my headlamp illuminating the secret world my grandfather had built, and I began to read the first page of his journal, ready to finally learn who I was. I don't know how long I was in that hidden chamber. Hours bled into a day, and then another. I had a few protein bars and a bottle of water in my small backpack, and when I slept, it was on a pile of old canvases in a corner of the workshop. The profound, geological silence of the cavern a comforting blanket. I read everything. I devoured his journals. I pored over his letters. I studied his maps. And page by page, a lifetime of secrets was revealed to me. My grandfather, Elias Carter, was a brilliant, self-taught geologist and a gifted sculptor. He had discovered the cavern system as a young man and spent his entire life exploring and mapping it. The Weeping Stone was his name for a unique, phosphorescent variety of calcite found nowhere else on Earth. It absorbed light and then glowed for hours in the dark with a soft, ethereal luminescence. It was his medium, his muse, his life's passion. The journals told the full story of the debt that had cost me my family. It was from a business partner who had cheated him, a violent man who believed Elias had hidden a fortune in the caves. The threats weren't just about money, they were about obsession. This man wanted the secret of the glowing stone. So Elias had faked poverty, lived a life of deliberate squalor, and funneled what little money he made into my anonymous upkeep at St. Jude's. He had made that money by smuggling out a few small, finished sculptures every year, selling them through a trusted intermediary to private collectors around the world who knew him only by a pseudonym. He was a celebrated artist in circles so exclusive I'd never heard of them. But he lived like a pauper to maintain his cover, to protect his secret, to protect me. His last journal entries were heartbreaking. He wrote about his failing health, his fear that he wouldn't live long enough to see my 18th birthday. He described preparing the ammo cans, writing the letters, and creating this trail of breadcrumbs for me to follow. His final entry, written in a shaky hand just a week before he died, was not about geology or art. It was addressed directly to me. "Leo," it read, "I hope you find this place not as a tomb, but as a beginning. The world will tell you that value is something you can count. That is a lie. True value is in the work of your hands, in the beauty you can create from the raw materials of the earth. I have left you not a fortune, but a craft. I have left you a home, not of wood and nails, but of stone and silence. This cavern has kept me safe, and it has given my life purpose. My greatest hope is that it can do the same for you. The tools are yours. The knowledge is in these books. The stone is waiting. The rest is up to you. Be better than me. Live in the light." I closed the journal, my heart aching with a profound sense of love and loss. I finally understood. The inheritance wasn't the land or the cabin or even the workshop. It was the choice he had given me, the choice to define my own worth. He hadn't abandoned me. He had been with me the whole time, a silent guardian angel living in a shack, working in a secret cave, all for me. The weight of his sacrifice was immense, but it wasn't a burden. It was a foundation. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. I looked around the workshop, at the half-finished sculptures, the patient tools, the waiting stones. This place wasn't a liability. It wasn't a dark hole. It was a sanctuary. It was a school. It was a legacy. The developer's $20,000 seemed like an insult, a pittance offered for a soul. They saw a quarry. My grandfather saw a universe. And now, so did I. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to sell. I was going to stay. I was going to learn. I was going to honor the life he had lived for me. I was going to be the keeper of the cavern. I was home. The next few months were the hardest and most rewarding of my life. I moved into the cabin, which, after weeks of hard work, started to feel less like a shack and more like a home. I patched the roof, replaced the rotten steps, and cleaned the grime of a decade from the windows. I used the last of my stipend to buy groceries and supplies in Sparrow Creek, where my regular appearances slowly turned the locals' suspicion into a grudging curiosity. I didn't tell them about the workshop in the cave. That was my secret, my grandfather's secret. My days fell into a rhythm. Mornings were for chores, chopping wood, tending to the small garden I had started, making the cabin livable. Afternoons were for learning. I would go into the cavern, to the hidden workshop, and I would study. I read my grandfather's geology books, memorized his maps, and practiced with his tools. My first attempts at carving the calcite were clumsy, disastrous. I broke more pieces than I finished. My hands were soft and unskilled, but I was patient. I had my grandfather's journals to guide me, his voice on the page a constant, encouraging teacher. Slowly, I began to understand the stone. I learned to read its grain, to anticipate its fractures, to coax the light from its depths. I carved a small, simple star, and when I polished it and took it into the darkness, it glowed with a soft, beautiful light. I held a piece of starlight in my hand, something I had made myself. In that moment, I felt a connection to my grandfather so powerful, it was as if he were standing right there beside me. I wasn't just his heir, I was his apprentice. One afternoon, my second-hand cell phone, which only got a signal if I stood on a specific rock at the edge of the clearing, rang. It was Mr. Finch. "Leo, good to hear your voice," he said, his tone professional as always. "I'm calling because I received a new offer from Northwood Holdings. They're getting impatient. They've raised their price to $50,000. They want an answer by the end of the week." I smiled. A few months ago, that number would have been my salvation. Now, it was just noise. "Thank you for letting me know, Mr. Finch," I said, my voice calm and clear. "But the property is not for sale. Not now, not ever." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "50,000 is a lot of money for that piece of land, son," he said gently. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said. I looked from the rock I was standing on toward the hillside, toward the hidden entrance to my whole world. My grandfather was right. Its value isn't something you can spend. I've found what he wanted me to find. I'm home. I could almost hear Mr. Finch smiling through the phone. "Elias would be very proud of you," he said. "If you ever need anything, you call me." We said our goodbyes, and I hung up. I stood there on that rock, the phone in my hand, and looked out over the small clearing, at the little cabin with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. The world saw a worthless hole in the ground and a shack on the verge of collapse. They saw a liability, but I saw a legacy. I saw a future. My grandfather had saved me, not by leaving me a fortune, but by leaving me a purpose. He taught me that the most valuable things in life are the ones you have to dig for. Maybe you've been handed something that looks like a burden too, a situation, a responsibility, a past that feels like a worthless piece of land. Maybe the world is telling you to sell it cheap, to get rid of it, to take the easy way out. But I'm here to tell you to look closer, to dig deeper, because sometimes the thing that looks like a liability is actually a legacy in disguise. The hole in the ground might just be the entrance to a home you never knew you had. If this story meant something to you, if it stirred something in your own heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. This is what we do here. We share stories about finding light in dark places, and I want you to share yours. In the comments below, tell me about a time you found value where no one else saw it. I read every single one, because your story is part of our story. Thank you for listening, and remember to look for the light.